Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook. And with me today is Dr. McKay Jenkins, who's the author of 7 books, including Contamination, The Last Ridge, and Bloody Falls of the Copper Mine. He is a professor of English journalism and environmental humanities at the University of Delaware. Jenkins lives with his wife and 2 children in Baltimore, Maryland. Dr. Jenkins, welcome to the program.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
This book, Food Fight, GMOs and the Future of the American Diet. First of all, I want to commend you for choosing this topic because it compelled you to do a lot of research in the Hawaiian Islands, and I think that's a smart move.
Thank you.
But this book... I have friends who are rabid anti-GMO folks, and what I appreciate is that this book really doesn't let us throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Well, exactly. And I would say when I started out this project, I had lots of friends that were rabidly anti-GMO too, and I knew some scientists that were rabidly pro-GMO, and it was a very tricky thing to try to figure out where best to walk through this particular minefield. So, as you mentioned, I traveled to Hawaii, I went to Kansas, I went to Missouri, I went to New England, I went to Maryland and Delaware and Pennsylvania, interviewing farmers and scientists and everybody I could think of, trying to make sense of this very noisy debate, and came up with some things that I thought were fairly surprising but quite interesting.
Well, let's start with the very first question you pose, and that is, are GMOs safe? Are they safe to eat?
Well, this, I think, is actually the first sentence in one of my chapters, which is everybody wants to know if they're safe, and that's really all they want to know, and that's really not the right question. Mm-hmm. So the quick answer to that is that very respected global scientific communities have said almost uniformly that genetically modified plants are not any more dangerous to eat than any normal plant. Period. Now that's fine, and that your listeners should take that to the bank, right? That seems to be the consensus. Mm-hmm. But that really is a very limited question. That is also, by the way, the statement that all these giant agricultural and chemical companies will say is, look, this is the scientific proof these things are not dangerous. But what that does is it shuts down any other kind of thinking about anything having to do with our diets, our health, our environment, anything else gets shut down when you say, okay, they're safe, therefore I'm not going to think about it anymore. And really, that's what the rest of the book and the rest of my research was trying to investigate, were these other questions, which are actually way more interesting and way more revealing than the simple question of safety.
Great.
So
yeah.
We can go any direction you like, but there really is quite a lot more to say about it than that.
And we certainly are going to do that. I think that in that first chapter, when you talk about people wanting to know are they safe, you mentioned that they don't contemplate the more important things like what these experiments in GMOs, especially the testing of herbicides and pesticides, have to do with climate change, obesity epidemic, decline of bee populations, water pollution, a lot of issues that are a lot larger. And that also speaks to something you mentioned earlier about the scientific research that the chemical companies put out. Well, they pretty much control what goes out, don't they?
Well, yeah, I think you've just raised about a dozen different questions. Let's start with the centralization of food production. So one of the things I thought was most interesting about this research was to think about, weirdly, the history of the interstate highway system. So I live on the East Coast and have for much of my life, and the East Coast, like other parts of the country, has been completely radically changed by the development of these interstate highways. So if you think about after World War II, all the soldiers came back, all these highways were built, then all these soldiers wanted to move out to the suburbs, so we created all these massive suburbs with all the ring roads around our cities and all the interstate highways. And the question is now, what were all those houses and shopping malls and all the rest of suburbia, what were they built on top of? And the answer is they were built on top of farms. So between the late 30s and now, we have lost 4 million small family farms across the United States, which means that the food production in the country has migrated inexorably to the Midwest. So now most of our food production, most of our calories is being produced in one part of the country. We now have 170 million acres of corn and soybeans. It's all GMO grown in the Midwest. So the question now is, what kind of food did we used to make, and what kind of foods do we make now? We used to make very different regional special foods, depending on climate, depending on landscape, depending on what local taste required. Great diversity of plants, great diversity of diet, all that sort of thing. Now we have a totally monochrome agriculture system, which is basically growing GMO soybeans, GMO corn, and then, of course, wheat, which is not yet GMO, but it could be very soon. And those grains can be grown in vast volumes. They can be harvested and then turned into all the processed food, all the fast food, all the soda, all the feed crops for all the something like 9 billion animals that we consume every year. So in other words, our diet, because of the loss of all these local farms, has turned into a highly industrialized system that produces extremely efficiently a very, very small number of crops controlled by a very small number of companies who, of course, have enormous influence in Washington because they're enormously profitable companies. So in many, many very deep structural ways, we are now dependent on a handful of companies growing a very small number of crops to create an entire food system, which, as you mentioned, is bad for our health because these are high-calorie, low-nutrition foods. It's bad for our environment because we're growing, one or two crops across basically the middle third of the United States, which has been massively destructive to plant diversity, animal diversity, bird diversity. It's reduced our water quality. I mean, all kinds of things have grown out of this phenomenon. Now, this was not the intention, but this is what has happened.
Mm-hmm. And the prime examples you gave of corn and soybean. With corn, I know that one of the things they've done is they've taken a gene from a bacterium and inserted it into a genome of corn, and that makes it resistant to plant-eating insects. But
Correct.
We haven't really explored whether eating insecticide-bred corn is good for us or not.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. Let's talk about two things. Let's talk about corn that is grown to resist caterpillars, and let's talk about soybeans that are designed to reduce herbicides. So let's start with the first one. So with corn, if you spray 90 million acres of corn with something, or if you not spray, but if you grow 90 million acres of corn with this Bt bacterium in it that is going to basically kill all the caterpillars, that's fine for the corn farmers. But this is something that you might not think about, which is that if you have 90 million acres that now has no caterpillars, what happens to all the birds that depend on eating caterpillars? Because, of course, it doesn't just kill the caterpillars that eat corn. It kills any caterpillar that might alight on that corn. So this is just one example of an ecological problem. Caterpillars happen to be a primary source of food for birds. And, nationwide we have really dangerously collapsing bird populations, which is in part caused by this monoculture agricultural system. If you take the soybeans, for example, they are grown so that you can spray them with an herbicide that will kill all the weeds, which again is great for farmers. But if you have 85 million acres of soybeans being sprayed with these herbicides, it kills all the weeds. Now, one of the weeds it kills is something called milkweed. Milkweed is the primary food source for monarch butterflies. Mm-hmm. And as everybody knows, the monarch butterfly population is now at something like 4% of what it used to be. In other words, we have no more monarch butterflies. And now that was not an intended consequence of these chemicals or the GMOs, but that is what has happened. So that's why if you pick up a package and it says like no GMOs on it, you'll see an image of the monarch butterfly, because that's become the symbol of the anti-GMO crowd, because they're saying, look, GMOs, forget about whether they're good or bad for your health. They're destroying monarch butterflies in addition to everything else. So this is another example of how GMOs is really part of a much bigger conversation that people should be interested in.
Mm-hmm. Those crops, the corn and the soybeans, are then fed to, you mentioned the 9 billion animals, are fed to hogs and cows and then the chickens. And so the meat that we eat, at least the cheap meat that we eat, is going to be affected by whatever GMOs are doing there, and however much insecticide, even though they're or herbicide, even though they're herbicide resistant, Roundup Ready soybeans, there's plenty of herbicide being ingested by our livestock, isn't there?
Yeah, no question. I mean, this is one of the things, like when you ask somebody, do you favor GMOs? And they say no. And they say, well, do you eat GMOs? They say, well, of course I don't eat GMOs. And we'll say, well, what did you have for dinner last night? And they'll say, well, I had chicken nuggets and I had nachos and I had a Coke.
Gosh.
And we say, well, there's GMO corn syrup in the Coke, and there's GMO soybeans that were fed to the chickens, and there's GMO corn in the corn chips. There's GMO in everything. It's just that you don't see it because it's an invisible ingredient in all the processed fast food that people eat. So that's what's so difficult about this, is that stuff is both everywhere and invisible at the same time. So if you're talking about 9 billion animals, I mean, here where I live, there on the eastern shore of Maryland and Virginia and Delaware, we raise something like 570 million chickens, for example. So what kind of crops are grown? The eastern shore is some of the most fertile land in the United States. It's mainly being used to grow soybeans to feed those 570 million chickens. Now, for an industrial food producer, that's a dream, right? Because it's good soil for the soybeans, and it's great to feed the soybeans to the chickens. It's not a good use of the land, because the land could be used to grow anything, not just fast food chicken nuggets. Of course, all those chickens also are now creating the greatest amount of pollution into the Chesapeake Bay, because chicken manure is massively, it's a massive nutrient for all the weeds and algae and stuff that grows in the Chesapeake. So we get these algae blooms and dead zones and all that kind of stuff. So again, is that a GMO problem? Not specifically and not directly, but it's an outgrowth of growing food at a massive scale in a very monochrome kind of way, as opposed to growing many different kinds of things on many smaller farms where the consequences are scaled way back. Right now, the problems are scaled way up, which is why we're talking about all this.
Mm-hmm. Let's look a little bit at the Big Five and at Hawaii before we look at some of the things that are promising about GMOs. We talk about the typical major issues: cancer, endocrine problems, headaches, stomach aches, immune system issues, even the function of our cells. And we don't really know if that's caused by GMOs or the chemicals we spray on those GMOs. But it looks to me like I mentioned the Big Five, I guess we should say, as Monsanto and Bayer and BASF and Syngenta and DuPont Pioneer. Is that right? Did I get those right?
Yeah, and Dow Chemicals up there. I mean, the companies that we normally associate with being chemical companies are very, very large players in the food business as well.
Mm-hmm. They at one time made weapons or helped with warfare, and they had to do something with those chemicals after that, right?
Well, this is another fascinating thing. So if you're a chemical company and you're making, supplies for ammunition in the war, and then the war ends, and now you've got to figure out a way to keep selling stuff, you can turn things that were used as, defoliants in war. For example, 2,4-D, which is a very common agricultural herbicide, was part of Agent Orange in Vietnam. When the war, and we know what kind of problems were caused by Agent Orange. When that war is over, you've got this huge supply of 2,4-D. Well, what are you going to do? You've got to try to figure out a way to sell it to homeowners or to farmers to kill weeds, which they did. And now 2,4-D is absolutely everywhere. Until a few years ago, it was sprayed on my college campus. So, it's in other words, you've got these chemicals and you've got to find a way to use them. Well, that is not necessarily the best first instinct, to convince homeowners that they should be spraying all these chemicals on their lawn just to so they can get rid of clover. You get rid of clover and now you've got no nitrogen in your soil. Now you got to go buy fertilizer. It's like this crazy loop that gets started once you get kind of chemically addicted. And the same thing is true with our farming. So you mentioned earlier, so I spent a bunch of time in Hawaii, and a couple of chapters in the book are about Hawaii and the fact that a lot of these crops are grown and experimented with these chemicals in tow on these little tiny islands in Hawaii, mainly because they have such great growing conditions there. They can grow 3 seasons out of the year. And so if you think about all the corn seeds and soybean seeds that grow all over the country, they are basically started or incubated on these little islands, and they are sprayed and sprayed and sprayed and sprayed as they experiment with all these different chemicals. And the truth is, of course, that they're actually human beings that live on these islands, and they are not too crazy about the fact that they are living right next to some of these experimental fields, and all these chemicals are blowing into their schools and into their houses and things. So there have been a lot of very interesting legal and political challenges to this, where you have little local homeowners associations trying to fight some of the biggest companies in the world. And then you get into this very complicated thing where these companies are begging the federal government to come in and stomp all over these local voter initiatives, because the companies have much more control in Washington than they do in local jurisdictions. So then you get into this whole question about the relationship between big companies and big government, and there's plenty to get kind of worked up about on that score.
Yeah, you mentioned when Clarence Thomas was appointed, a decision that he made that affects this industry. But I was fascinated in Hawaii by how diligent they were, because some of these herbicide and insecticide testing grounds were right next to schools, and kids' health problems were increasing significantly. And they had ballot initiatives, and they voted them in, although occasionally someone in the government was influenced to reduce the odds of their winning, whether it was rewording a proposition or a mayor vetoing something. It was just amazing how deeply entangled in government these big companies are.
Well, right, and think about what's at stake, right? So if you start, let's say a little county in Hawaii beats the companies, and then another county beats the companies, and then, the state of Vermont beats the companies, and maybe the state of California finally, gets a labeling measure on the ballot or something. Step by step, these companies are terrified that GMOs will become such a toxic term that the public sentiment will turn against them. So they can't afford that because, forget about Kauai, Hawaii. What we're talking about is hundreds of millions of acres devoted to billions of dollars worth of seeds and chemicals. And if suddenly the world loses its appetite for that, these companies are going to be in very bad shape. So one of these battles in Hawaii took place in Maui. And just like on Kauai, Maui voters beat back these companies, but the companies put something like $8 or $9 million into fighting this thing. This is a county initiative, a county ordinance. And suddenly you've got these global conglomerates putting all this, like millions and millions of dollars to make sure that they win this thing. And lo and behold, the companies lost. And the problem is the companies then immediately turned around and appealed all this in federal court, saying it's not up to local people to decide how their land is going to be used. And this becomes a very interesting question for democracy. Like, who should decide how your land is used? If you think about your neighborhood, should you and your neighbors have control about what is grown or sprayed on that crop, or is that a federal question? And the reason the companies want it to be a federal question is because companies have a much easier time controlling Congress or controlling the White House than they do running around trying to put out fires in the millions of little counties around the country that might have their own peculiar interests in getting rid of things. So those stories in Hawaii were, I thought, a very interesting case where you're pitting local land control against global companies and the federal government that were basically working together. Mm-hmm. So that those are issues that all communities around the country ought to be interested in.
I was fascinated that one of the companies, formerly AstraZeneca, I guess, is now Syngenta, and they're based in Switzerland. And one of the pesticides they were testing is forbidden in Switzerland. That brings up a larger point about how many European countries are resisting GMOs, and Canada, to a large extent, is resisting GMOs. But on the flip side, you have this great story about papayas on the Big Island.
Yeah, well, let me take one of those first. So the question about Syngenta, it's also true in Germany, where they make these what are called neonicotinoid pesticides, which are the ones that are thought to be responsible for killing bees all around the world. Mm-hmm. So it's a German company making a product that Germany has prohibited and Europe has prohibited, but we sell them in the U.S. Syngenta makes atrazine, which is banned in Switzerland. It's banned in Europe, but we're allowed to spray it here. So my last book, called Contamination, which you mentioned, is all about this kind of thing. Why is it that European countries ban chemicals that we are happy to include in our cosmetics or on our farms or in our yards? And that is something that people ought to think about. Like, why is it that we put the health of industry ahead of the health of our health, like the health of our public health, our bodies and our landscape? That's a really good question. So then you asked about the papaya, which is an industry that is grown on the Big Island of Hawaii. And there you have an example of a researcher who was a university, that is to say a public researcher, not a corporate researcher, who saw the papaya plantations on his home island being devastated by a virus. it was just chewing through all of these different papaya plantations, and he was able to figure out in a laboratory how to make papaya resistant to this virus. And now you have this thing called the rainbow papaya, which you can buy on the West Coast and in Hawaii, which is resistant. So the papaya plantations were literally saved by genetic engineering. And that's a great story. It's a feel-good story, but that was not done by corporations. That was done by a university professor.
There are a number of stories like that in here about independent and nonprofit research that isn't funded by the big companies or isn't largely funded by the big companies seem to be producing more that's helpful to the hungry and the poor than are the big companies.
Correct. That's true. And if you think about, when the companies say the world needs GMOs, that is disingenuous because the world doesn't need their GMOs. The world doesn't need more corn and soybeans. If the world needs GMOs, the kind of genetic engineered plants that they need are things that are going to grow, for example, in drought conditions in Africa or in that are going to bring vitamin A to people that are vitamin A deficient in Asia or something like that. That kind of research is very exciting, but it's all being done by scholars, professors, scientists at laboratories that are at universities or in nonprofit research institutes. So this isn't. You started out by talking about how muddy some of this is. Like the public hears, we need GMOs to feed the world, which is a brilliant marketing idea, but it's the question is like which kind of GMOs does the world need? And the kind of GMOs that these companies are producing is not what the world needs. The world may need these other things, but those are being done by public university people.
And the locally grown crops are helping people grow healthy crops or crops that facilitate health locally is important. The golden rice story is really interesting to me.
Yeah, so the golden rice was actually a grain that made the cover of Time magazine about 15 years ago. And they said, this grain is going to save millions of children around the world. So this was a bunch of, again, publicly funded researchers designing a rice grain that would be full of beta-carotene, which when you eat it would produce vitamin A. And it turns out that lots of people in rice-dependent cultures, which of course they're all over the world, rice is a huge part of the global diet, they get plenty of calories from the rice, but they don't get a lot of nutrition, and there are a lot of vitamins and minerals that they're not getting. So the idea was if you have lots of people eating rice and they're all vitamin A deficient, how can you get them vitamin A? So they figured out how to genetically alter this rice, turn it golden, so it's sort of orangey looking, because it's like a carrot. Now it has beta-carotene in it. And that seemed great. The trouble is that the countries where they were trying to introduce this were so suspicious of GMOs because of what they had heard, the reputations of all these big corporations. They wouldn't buy it. They're not eating it. They're not approving it. So that's an interesting thing. There's another thing where people in these cultures said, that's all fine, but we don't eat orange rice. We eat white rice. White rice is something that is part of our culture. Our culture doesn't recognize what orange rice is. Mm-hmm. And you'd have public health people saying, forget about your culture, eat this, it's good for you.
Right.
And then you had culture saying, take your Western science away, we eat white rice. And so you had science banging up against kind of cultural traditions. So the whole thing is very interesting. None of this is simple. None of this is black or white.
Yeah. In 3 decades, we're going to have 2 billion or more additional souls on the planet, and a lot of population growth is in Asia and the sub-Sahara region, and that's where there's a lot of poverty and a lot of hunger. And there have been efforts to make several things healthier through genetic engineering.
That's true. And, like I said, a lot of that work is being done by university researchers. Now, a really big question, and I'm not saying I have an answer to it, but do we need Monsanto to feed those people? Mm-hmm. Monsanto would love to feed those people because they've already saturated the North American market. But a bigger question, really a more holistic question, is wouldn't it be better if local people could feed themselves? This might be a drag on global profits for companies, but really what you want, I think, not just in the developing world, but here, is we want local people to feed themselves. So you want local farmers, people who are growing really good food that is specifically designed to grow where they grow. So, you grow cassava in Africa and you grow tomatoes in New Jersey, and, you grow corn in Iowa, but you grow papaya in Hawaii, and everybody eats what they grow. And you don't have to have, a food system that is completely dependent on shipping everything around the world 24 hours a day. They say that the average American food product travels 1,500 miles from the farm until to the table.
Mm-hmm.
That is not a sustainable system. That the carbon footprint alone of that system is one of the great contributors to climate change. So we've got to kind of get back to the way things were for thousands and thousands of years, which is more farmers growing more diverse crops, more nutritious crops, and kind of decentralizing all this food production.
Mm-hmm. And that centralization was highlighted to me when you mentioned that basically if you go into a supermarket in Hawaii, nothing is grown in Hawaii. It's all shipped in from the mainland to
Oh my gosh!
Safeway.
If you go to Hawaii, it's absolutely stunning how productive the Hawaiian climate and soil is. And there's a guy in the book who's a kind of a food advocate, and he went to the state food budget for high school kids, and he said, "Let me see the budget for what you guys are spending all your money on." Now, this is Hawaii, where you can grow absolutely anything all the time. It is really remarkably fertile place. And the two top items on the food budget for the state of Hawaii were like $5 million worth of oranges from Florida and 5 million apples, I think, from New York. And he's like, what is going on here? You're spending $10 million on fruit that has to travel across the continent when we, local farmers, could push really densely nutritious food into our own kids' cafeterias. We would support local farmers. We would support local nutrition. We'd be taking better care of our land. We'd be lowering the carbon footprint of all this food. Let us feed our own people. But the school system was contractually hooked into these global food distribution companies. Mm-hmm. So that's the craziness of this. It's like that doesn't even make any sense.
Right.
Except this is the way things get centralized.
Well, the tangled web we weave in this environment, this current political environment where regulation is bad. I'm really worried about what's going to happen here. I want to turn back, though, to the activists just for a moment because I only got a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to mention Greenpeace and others on Hawaii were painting with a broad brush, and so they were even fighting this great papaya that's resistant to the disease that was destroying it on the island. And I think that's one of the things we face constantly is the Greenpeace and other organizations are trying to kill off GMOs, and there's some things that they could really contribute to the world.
Yeah, I think that's a fair criticism. I understand why they're doing what they're doing. What they're trying to do is make a big push against GMOs, and it's very difficult, as you know, to make a subtle political argument these days. Like, you have to say something is either all bad or all good, or nobody bothers to listen to you. So, in Hawaii, to be honest, there are people that are resistant to the GMO papaya because, there's some countries in the world that import papaya from Hawaii that don't want GMOs. Mm-hmm. So it took, for example, a long time for Japan to wrestle with this question, and the people who were growing non-GMO papaya were very worried about cross-contamination. Like, what happens if their non-GMO papaya is suddenly crossing with a GMO papaya, and a buyer in Japan says, we found GMO in your papaya. You told me it was non-GMO. We're not going to buy it anymore. Mm. So that's a legitimate argument. But I think throwing all GMOs into one tub and saying that they're all bad is not necessarily helpful. It's certainly not subtle. There really is more complexity here than most groups on either side are willing to admit.
Mm-hmm. And you have talked about some of the wonderful and unique foods that you got to encounter in various places and some of the research that's going on from coast to coast and in Hawaii as well. And I hope that people will give this a fair read because I think a balanced account as you've provided is important. We've been talking with McKay Jenkins, the author of Food Fight, GMOs and the Future of the American Diet. It's a good read, and we haven't even scratched the surface of all the fascinating details that you'll find inside this book from Food Fight. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. I remind you, if you don't hear our regular broadcast on 88 FM, you can catch us on YouTube at Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. Thanks for listening.